Hey, everybody, this is Bishop John Selders, and welcome to our first installment of what I hope will be a regular uh, opportunity and offering for us to have some conversations. We're calling them relevant conversations with some of our friends from near and far to talk about stuff that's important to us here in Connecticut, here in the United States, but in many instances, what happens here also has implications for us throughout the world. And so I am extremely proud and happy to be in this conversation and to be in this conversation with a couple of my friends and my brothers in the work. Let me introduce you to them, and then I'm going to bring them into this conversation, and we can get this we get this party started. All right. The Reverend Cedric Harmon is the executive director for Many Voices, an advocacy national advocacy group that does training, and he can tell you all about that stuff. But let me tell you, for over a decade, he was the field organizer and the field director and religious organizer for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Cedric, I got it right. I got it right this time. I got it right. Every time I introduce him, I messed that up, and I was determined I was going to get that right tonight. I had to practice on that. Anyway, we have known each other. Just a personal sidebar. We've known each other for the vast majority of our life. We're from the same neck of the woods in the Midwest, place called St. Louis, and in the St. Louis region. And so we are brothers indeed in the work. Let me just bring him into the room, Cedric, and say hello and greet the peoples.
Hello and good evening. It's a joy to be with you, Bishop Selders, and with all of you, the audience members, on this, the 7th day of January, 2022. Can't believe we're already 7 days into this.
Right. And our other guest tonight is no stranger to those of us in and around Connecticut. He's one of those people when they need a professor to talk on it, they call for this brother. And I was saying to Reverend Harmon earlier that you are Brother Bilal, you are our resident local NPR personality and pundit. And so Dr. Bilal Sekou is associate professor for political science for the Hillier College, which is in the larger University of Hartford. And he's also the board chair for Common Cause Connecticut. He's the advisory board chair. And he's been an important person to many of us in the work. And so, Brother Bilal, why don't you come into the room and greet the folk who are here tonight?
Well, thank you so much. I had no idea this was the first one of these. And so I really feel, honored that you reached out to me to be a part of this conversation on this really important issue. And yes, we're 7 days into the new year, and it's starting well for me. And so hopefully we'll get out of COVID soon and it'll be even better.
Right. But yeah, so we've had, we do all kinds of internet and virtual events. And this one, I thought we would spend time. This one would feature me and in conversations about stuff I want to talk about, quite frankly, or about stuff that I think is important. And I don't want to put myself under any pressure to have to do any of that kind of thing on any kind of regular basis. So that's why I'm glad of this forum and this venue and the internet. The internet has brought us to this reality that we can have conversations, we can do it, and we can broadcast it, use our platforms, and say what it is that we need to say. And so why don't we jump in? We got a little bit of time here. Why don't we just jump in? A year ago, January 6th, 2021, we had a boy, what was that? Let me just say it like that. What was that? I was in my office, and all of a sudden there was a stirring. My phone started buzzing and text started coming in. Are you watching this? And then, of course, my brother Cedric, Reverend Harmon, when he texts me, I'm like, oh boy, I better pay it. What is it now? So I turned, I got on the internet, and boy, I was amazed at what we were watching in real time, right? And so let's spend a little time on it. What we did here locally, we did I believe that evening, and Cedric, you were part of that, and some others. The evening or the next night, we held space, and we had probably 100 or more folk who just joined on a Zoom. We just on a Zoom. We were in the midst of COVID, right? And we just wanted to talk about it, and people shared. I don't know if you remember that night, but for 2 hours, we just held space for folk to talk about what they felt. So I felt it was important here a year later to have some conversation about what happened at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And so anybody feel like they want to jump in there? It's so much. There are a number of things I want to say, but what are your initial, a year later, your initial thoughts and impressions, Reverend Harmon?
So thank you. Yes, it has been a year since those events occurred, and we all that were able to during the live moments to watch it live, and then those that weren't able to watch it live came home to this and watched it throughout the evening. So the first thing to say is we actually saw what we saw. There will be people that will try to convince us that we did not see or experience what we actually experienced on that day. This was real. These were real people stampeding the United States Capitol, breaking glass, running over officers, running over each other. At least one person that was part of the crowd was shot and killed. Several officers lost their lives either in that moment or following. And there's mental health challenges that still live with people from that day, including the staff of members of Congress, which we cannot forget. It was not just the congresspersons themselves, it was their staffs. There were children of members of Congress on Capitol Hill that day that had to hunker down for fear of their lives. There were gallows hung. There were gallows hung on the grounds of the United States Capitol. They intended to hang Mike Pence, or at least said that that's what their intent was. This was an insurrectionist, violent, extreme challenge, not just to democracy, but a challenge to the way in which this country is developing and evolving. These folks wanted to take us back to a time where public hangings was acceptable. Acceptable. Regularly, people were hung, and they wanted to return to such a time. And it wasn't just a challenge to democracy, which we now hear these days. They challenged democracy. They challenged the processes of the democratic system as we have come to understand it.
Yeah. I think what amazed me the most about that day was that this was a coup attempt that had actually been planned in the open, right? I mean, Donald Trump telegraphed before the election that he wasn't going to accept the outcome of the election unless he won. And so any outcome that did not declare him the winner would be invalid. And so we watched for, the better part of a month, or really 2 months, what was really an effort to build up to that moment that we saw in Washington. And again, what was amazing about it was that it was planned in the open, that people essentially were telegraphing that they were going to Washington and that they were going to raise hell. And then when you actually saw that morning and you listened to people talk and work up the crowd, I mean, Rudy Giuliani and others who spoke, at that rally, in many ways, what happened really was not surprising. And I think really for us, as we think about how we protect what is much more fragile than I think people understand it is, which is democracy, that it's something that you can't take for granted. You can't take for granted that there will be free and fair elections, right? And let me sort of contextualize this, that America has not always been a democracy. I mean, really in the the post-Voting Rights Act era, we began to approach what we can consider a democratic society. And yet right now, the events of that day and what really happened the 4 years up to that day and the years since that day means that our democracy is really being threatened in ways that we really need to take much more seriously than I think a lot of us are probably doing. There are real threats out there. And Donald Trump is the avatar of a very deep rot that's a part of the American, there's a part of American society right now where people are, feeling as if authoritarian or totalitarian behavior is acceptable. I mean, there's a recent poll that came out where a substantial number of Americans say that they embrace the idea of violent revolt against the government, a much higher percentage of that among Republicans. About 71% of Republicans think the election was stolen. And so we are at a very critical moment in our society right now, and we're not guaranteed to move forward in a successful way unless we fight for this thing.
Yeah. So you said something that I want to just explore just for a few minutes. What we call democracy just really started to be, in some real way, 1965, and I would submit, like many, and I'm thinking you were pointing to this. It was only when we were able to vote legally. And then there was the pre-clearance and all the stuff that existed in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that allowed for not just the rank and file of quasi-Americans, and not just Black folk, but a large number of others who slid in under this idea of flattening the access to the vote, and harkening back 100 years before to the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment, right? So that what we had codified into law and then placed it in a particular way in our Constitution now could be actually lived out in a certain kind of way. So I want to just pause and say that's what you were referencing, right?
Yes,
Dr.
absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
And in essence, I mean, in many ways, the achievements of the civil rights era, this is a reaction to that, right? What we see, Donald Trump is a reaction to these achievements that have occurred, though there's still a long way to go. But certainly the notion that somehow America is getting away from the people who have traditionally held power in this country, in this case, white men who have held power in this country, there is this sense among many of them that they are losing their grip on that power. I mean, and what's astonishing about what happened in Washington is that when you actually look at the makeup of the crowd, I remember the initial reaction I had from a friend of mine. He was like, oh, these are working class white people who've come from Western Pennsylvania, these, towns, these post-industrial towns where meth and heroin has sort of exploded and taken over. And my initial reaction was, there's no way that the people came from Western Pennsylvania, went to Washington, D.C. and stayed there a couple of days. It's expensive to make a trip like that, right? So, when you look at that crowd, right, what's amazing is that it's also not people who come from places where an overwhelming majority of the population is white. In fact, a disproportionate number of the people came from some of the most diverse states in the country. And they didn't come from the whitest parts of those diverse states. They came from places where the communities in which they came from were actually growing more diverse. So this reaction, this sense of loss, this status anxiety that is fueling the Trumpism at a certain level is a part of what we saw played out. These were people who were small business owners. These were white collar and blue collar workers. This was not the lumpen proletariat who were in Washington, D.C. rioting. This was middle-class white people who have really saw their stock portfolios increase during COVID, who've been able to work from home on laptops and computers because they're white-collar workers, for example. They were in Washington, D.C. rioting. That gives you a sense of just how crazy that moment actually was.
Yeah. And what's also interesting about that is that they see in Donald Trump their leader, the one that voices their concerns, the one that understands, quote unquote, their plight. Well, what plight? You're able to stay at home. You're able to remain safe in the midst of a pandemic, but they still saw him as representing their interests, and they wanted to maintain his grip on power because that also maintained their grip on power. And it also was a reaction to the numbers, the droves of Black and brown and other people of color who had gone to the polls, who had sent in their mail-in ballots in order to change the direction of this country, and in reaction to Trumpism. So they wanted to hold on to Trumpism at all costs. And they said, we were invited. We were invited here. This is our house. We pay your salaries, was the words that they said to the officers, the Capitol Police. We pay your salaries. These are our tax dollars. So it was a dismissal of the will of the voters that had struggled to cast a vote. It takes a lot of time to stand in those lines in Atlanta and in Milwaukee, etc., to cast those ballots. But they felt that they had every right to come and stay in a hotel, the Trump Hotel, in Washington, D.C., and then get in the streets and march. And it's interesting the way they were attired. They were dressed to suggest the proletariat, when in fact that's not how they actually live their lives. They were dressed in such a way as to say that we are fighters, we are warriors in a battle for the soul of America, the America that we want to maintain.
I mean, ex-military, police officers. I mean, this was an interesting crowd when you actually break them down, and they really do, in fact, represent a segment of the country that, has real grievances, real concerns, but those concerns are fueled by the demographic changes that Cedric, hinted at, and the fear of what that may mean for that sort of grip, that disproportionate grip on power and influence in society. And so, the status anxiety is real, and the perception that America is changing in ways and that it's moving away from them, and that their sort of grip and hold on power will not be there if these demographic changes do in fact come to fruition. I sometimes think about, for the last decade plus, they've been talking a lot about by 2040 or 2050, America would, be a majority minority country. I think in many ways, we didn't think as much as we should have thought about how that is being received by a lot of white Americans who are worried about their status and their grip on power and influence and social status in American society.
So thank you. There are a couple of things. One, isn't it interesting to me, at least, that the vote is always what gets used when power wants to be in charge, right? It starts to constrict and limit. So, Cedric, you raised it that it was the vote that the images of the lines in Atlanta or Milwaukee or Philadelphia, right? These centers of Black, Black people and the populations that were voting, who turned the tide, in that the senatorial election down in Georgia. So the influence of the vote is very meaningful. Would you want to say more? Could you say more and speak, both of you, from the several different places I know you've worked at and you've done? In particular, I'm thinking about Cedric and the work you've done in electoral politics. Say more about the power of the vote and what that has meant in this, what I'm going to call myth around power.
Yes. So, it is not lost on me that we lost Congressman John Lewis just prior to the election. And then the kind of reorientation of the blood that was shed, the sacrifice that was made in order to secure the franchise for Black and brown people. We gave out that narrative, and we share that narrative, but in many ways, that narrative may have occurred to many of those folks that showed up in Washington as an affront. It was an affront to them, and it reminded them of something that they thought they had lost. So Black and brown people received the right to vote. We lost some of our power as a result of them receiving that right to vote and securing that right to vote. The right to vote is a cornerstone of a democracy, that you get to choose those who will represent you. And a democracy in many ways is pointing to the ability of the people or their representatives to deliberate and decide. Now, those deliberations or the decisions are based on factual information and on some understanding of what is true. The Trump administration and Trumpism offered alternative facts and a variance of what is true. Lies became truth, truth became falsehood, facts became questionable, science was to be dismissed. And so this set up a belief in a false narrative. And one big part of the false narrative was there were huge irregularities in the election of 2020. Huge irregularities. Just illusory irregularities were put forth by lawyers. This was going to be challenged. We had all these challenges in the courts prior to January 6th. So we had already laid the groundwork that there's something wrong with this election. And the title of the rally was Stop the Steal. So again, suggesting that something had been stolen. Now, if you already feel like you're losing, which many in that crowd felt, and then you're told something's been stolen from you, which was said from the podium, and then you're told we're going to march to the Capitol and I'll be there with you, a lie, because he was not down there at the Capitol with them. But they believed that he was going to be there. And then they walked into the halls of Congress and said, we want Trump. They expected him to show up in the halls of Congress, but he was at home in the White House watching them fight for him on the basis of a lie that had become truth. So what we have is lies believed as truth, falsehoods accepted as real, election outcomes questionable when there was no question. This was the most secure election that we've had in this country in a long time. This sets up a violent reaction. The fuel had already been prepared, the match was struck, and we had the conflagration at the Capitol.
So in many ways, he sounds like the political scientist. I like that. The other thing that struck me about, what happened that day, again, and I have to go back to the buildup to that day, right? And, and certainly this coup, as I said, was planned in the open. And the rejection of the 2020 election, which was then followed by, of course, that incredible victory in Georgia, right? And I think it's important to say also that the vote is not something that Black and brown people received. They fought for, and people died for that right to vote. And certainly one of the things that the right understands, and right-wing politicians and the Republican Party in general, is that suppressing that vote is key to maintaining their power in the country, right? And what was so astonishing about what happened that January, and also that November, but also certainly that January, was that in spite of these efforts to suppress the right to vote of people of color, they still showed up in just extraordinary ways, right? And it was an amazing testament to people's understanding of the importance of that tool in this liberation struggle that Black people have been engaged in since we were brought here as chattel slaves, right? And so what's key for Republicans, obviously, is trying to take away as much of that vote as possible and to undermine the confidence that people will have in those election outcomes. Now, I think they run the risk because this level of suspicion that elections are fraudulent, that the way in which the administrators of elections are operating is also fraudulent. They run the risk of really blowing this whole thing up. So, they're playing with fire right now in a way that I think they don't fully understand. I mean, an example of that is Donald Trump trying to walk back this idea of getting vaccinated, and he's being booed now when he tries to say that. So they've created the Frankenstein monster, right? And they don't know quite what to do with it. So there's a real risk here. But it means also for those of us who care about the right to vote and see that as an important tool, not the only tool. Elections will not solve all of our problems, but it is an important tool that we need in our sort of toolkit in order to fight against white supremacy and race and discrimination in this country, and to create the kind of country where someone like Donald Trump won't be elected. Someone who, from the moment he descended that escalator, I knew at that moment that he was a racist, a xenophobic, he was a sexist, he was a megalomaniac, he was narcissistic, and I can go on, right? I knew that the moment he descended that escalator. I knew that as I watched that campaign unfold. And it's amazing to see so many Americans nonetheless still vote for him. Understand, 71 million Americans saw what I saw and what you saw for 4 years and said they wanted an Act 2. 71 million people came out and voted for him to be reelected to office. And so this battle that we have for the soul of this country is a real battle, and it's a battle that is much, much larger than I think we really understand. Again, 71 million Americans voted for him, and 71% of Republicans still believe he actually won the election, that it was stolen from him. And so essentially what Republicans understand is that if they can suppress enough of the votes of Black and brown people, in particular, and indigenous people as well, that a majority of the white population will vote for a Donald Trump type figure. And in fact, I show my students when I teach American national government and campaigns and elections, I show them a map from 2016 in which if only whites had voted, this country would be ruby red. And if only white men had voted, it would be bloody red, right? And so this is what's at stake. And this is why this battle is just so important for all of us to be engaged in.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a moment, though, about, Black folk in particular, and I'll say Black folk and other persons of color, but I'm going to say Black folk have been the champions for the vote for as far back as before the abolitionist movement in the early and mid 18th century, right, or 19th century, where the struggle was let's end and abolish, in the enslavement period and come into some version of citizenship, right? Again, equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment is about that, right? And yet, we have been the champions for this very thing, and at almost every hand been fought against being and becoming full citizens. So there's it's not suspicion. There's a bit of I'm going to say it nicely, ambivalence about voting. So when during the campaign, a number of us were asked to be in the field, and let's have some real field work conversation. And a couple of my buddies as if I would show up at the barbershop. And we're gonna have a conversation around the way with the brothers and the sisters at the barbershop, in the spaces where we are, and to have had we had great conversation. We did a 5 set tour at barbershops and beauty salons across Connecticut, just talking to brothers and sisters about the vote and its importance, and to hear what we heard and to be advocating for it, and then to have what happened right a year ago, in some way almost reinforced the idea that we did here, is that why should I vote? Because it doesn't really matter anyway. Because there are other folk who are in charge. Speak to that if you would, either one of you.
So the vote is extraordinarily important, but we have to realize we are 50 plus years beyond 1965. We have generations that did not witness what we witnessed and have not seen the footage and understand the sacrifice that went into securing that vote. You go back further, Reconstruction is a word, but people don't really understand what Reconstruction actually meant. That we had Black elected officials in Congress for the first time in the history of this country, and then there was a reaction, a backlash. Jim Crow was a reaction to Reconstruction. And so every time we are making progress and we secure the vote and we show up in large numbers, there is a negative reaction to our exercising our power and showing our power. And in this moment, the reaction showed up in terms of an insurrection at the Capitol. The vote matters because who will represent us in Congress and how will we receive the services and benefits that all citizens of this country have a right to. We as a people have generally accepted and believed in the Bill of Rights. We have believed in the Constitution of the United States. We take those documents and those founding documents seriously as a people. We have. That's why King and Lewis and Abernathy and Andrew Young walked those streets and fought so hard. That's why those young children and the grandmamas and mamas went to those church basements, because they believed in this country and believed that this country was as much theirs as it was anyone else's. However, in the backlash, when you're not seeing the benefits, the fruit of your labor, you can become weary and disenchanted with this notion of the ideal of democracy. Does democracy really serve me? What am I actually getting out of this deal? And so just like you, Bishop Selders, all of the year leading up to the election, I was making phone calls and sending text messages and talking with folks, encouraging folks to get out and vote, because there had become a diminution of a desire to participate in the electoral process because it didn't seem to be working in our interests. At this moment, this is a matter of survival, because if the people that stormed the Capitol have their way, the impact upon Black and brown folk will be deleterious. We will suffer tremendously in ways that we cannot even fully imagine. So we must again inspire participation in this very flawed democracy. It has never been perfect. I completely denounce this notion of making America great again, because America has not been fully great in my lived experience. Not fully great. It gets close to pretty good, and then there's always a retrenchment. That's been my experience. I don't know about anybody else. We take 5 steps forward and we take 25 steps in the reverse. That has been my experience. We elect someone, they make promises and say that they will have our back, and we keep wondering, where are you? And why is this knife stuck in my back? So this has been the experience of Black and brown and indigenous folks. Promises are made, treaties are signed, and they are not even worth the ink on the paper. So that's been, but we continue to engage in the process, because I do think the process is worth fighting for. So Dr. Sekou, I believe that we are charged to fight for this democracy with all our might.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I'm not too interested in even reliving yesterday, let alone the 1950s. So I'm good with moving forward, looking forward, Nothing about the past in America excites me as something that I want to revisit at all. But I think, the way I sort of see this, and what I would add to what I thought you really stated quite eloquently, is that voting and electoral politics cannot be the only thing that we do, right? And so when I look at like my brother, Selders, and someone who I admire because he's out there in the streets, when unarmed Black people are being gunned down in the streets, Bishop Selders is one of the folks I see right out there drawing attention to what has happened and arguing for the need for justice, right? So elections and electoral behavior is one of the tools in the toolkit. We also need to build a movement, right? We need to organize ourselves. We need to be out in the streets putting pressure on the society, right? We also need vision. We need imagination about the kind of world we want to live in, because there's a lot that's wrong with the world as it currently operates, right? In which imperialism and sexism and racism and homophobia are accepted by far too many people in our country. So we need a different vision of America, a different vision for the world. And we need people to articulate that vision and engage in conversation with people. So when Brother Bishop said he's out there in the barbershop having conversations with people, not only about the importance of voting, but what we hope to achieve by voting, right? What is the vision we have of Hartford? What is the vision we have of Connecticut? What is the vision we have of America? But what is the vision we have of the world? Black and brown people are catching hell all over this planet, right? As are lots of other people. So for me, electoral politics, we cannot escape the reality that that is an important part of the game that occurs in our country. But it isn't the only thing we need to be involved in. We need to be teaching. We need to be talking and engaged in dialogue with people all across the city of Hartford and across our state and across our country. And all of that is really focused on that vision we have of the kind of country we want to live in. And so when you think about the civil rights movement and the struggles that occurred and the Chicano movement and the American Indian movement and the LGBTQ movement, all of these movements were focused on transformation. They said the status quo was not acceptable. And so this vote is a tool that helps us to shape this new vision of America, to put in place the kind of leaders that we imagine will do the work of helping to shape that. But ultimately, we've got to organize in our communities. We've got to continue the work that both of you do, in working with your flock and the people that you talk to and the communities and the relationships you build within those communities. We've got to see that grow into a movement for real change, something that says that America today is not the country it needs to be tomorrow. And we certainly cannot go back to a mythical past that was not good for people who look like me and you.
Lord have mercy. I mean, so I said this about our. I live here in the city of Hartford, and I say to the residents, it doesn't take rocket science to understand that the poverty, the plight that Black and brown folk in the city of Hartford are living, right? That they would return to, or that they would turn to figuring out how to make ends meet in at whatever means they could figure that out, right? And so it seems to me when you become an elected official, you have some import as with the systems that are employed, that you would try to bring remedy to the plight of the folk that live in the space and place that you're in. And it just baffles me. I can't understand why you don't understand that Pookie and Ray Ray need a job, man. They need a job. They're trying to feed their people, trying to get Big Mama out to projects and get her into a nice place. It's, Pampers. And when you're not delivering that on a day-to-day, but what I do see is folk who are already making money, make more money. Well, I'm a little upset by that, right? And so, and there are ways in which, and you were referring to this, Brother Sekou, that there are ways in which historically we've been able to advocate for our elected folk, but not just elected folk who are in power, who have influence, who are change makers, who are delivering services. There are ways to put pressure on them to do the right thing. In the reverse, what we saw, and what is in my mind a symbol of the almost the reverse, that you can articulate a frame, a lie. All right, they coming to take your job. They coming to, ain't nobody checking. We don't want your job. We just trying to, anyway. But
critical race theory, yeah.
That's right, critical race theory, and you don't even know about no critical and race. You don't know nothing and theory. You don't even know how that thing came up. But all of a sudden in Virginia, that cry of critical race theory in local school boards turned that tide around down there in some ways. Of course, you also, if we're talking politics, you got to run the right candidate. I'm gonna just leave that there. I'm gonna just leave that right there. But what I can also say, we know that when we band together, when across whatever our differences are, if we organize in a way toward our own interest, the majority of us, if we were to do so, we could change everything, right? But we somehow, we get thrown off our square. And Bacon's Rebellion is a prime example of before this country became a nation, right? In the 1600s, when poor folk, poor white folk, black folk, Native Americans, women, when they got together and started organizing, well, they created a kind of a stir that then the elite said, wait a minute, elite with weapons, using the military, they had to put that down. And every time there's been those movements, we talk about a backlash. I think about the late 1890s in Wilmington, where you had black mayor, black everybody, and all of a sudden white folks said, and a coup occurred, and they unseated all of the folk, right? The coups have happened in this here United States before. And so what we saw as a symbol, in my opinion, is a throwback to that kind of thing. We want our spot back. Y'all done had 8 years of that other, the other guy, right? And so now let's put our guy in, and literally they did nothing but stood in the way. There was not a vision cast for how we move forward. There was a vision cast about what's wrong and what we need to claim back. But there was not any forward movement around a vision toward how do we build together. And quite frankly, I want to hear more about that I can get with, rather than trying to unpack this other stuff. What y'all think about that?
So you had a lot in there. That's one thing. But one of the things that you were pointing to is, in general, the Republican Party, sadly, has built itself on the foundation of fear, anger, and grievances, which appeals to people who do have a real, legitimate claim of difficulty in their lives. And then out of that fear, anger, and grievance, you name the perpetrator that is causing your fear, your anger, and your grievances to exist. And that is a tool of division. So you succeed as that party by dividing and narrowing, not by unifying. Because if poor whites and poor Black and poor Native combine, those numbers overwhelm the corporate oligarch infrastructure that fuels the Republican Party. Republicans would never win if poor Black, poor white, poor indigenous people got together and had a vision and voted toward their interests. So you convince them that their interest is in opposition to Black folk, to immigrant folk, to Native folk. So that division allows them to hold on to power. Now, I wasn't confused by the George Floyd summer of reckoning. We saw coming together in the streets. And what we saw also are corporations and name brand products appeal to that reckoning. And they appeal to that reckoning along public relations, changing the names of products, all surface stuff. And all that surface stuff fed their bottom line. And nothing really substantially changed in our nation. Corporations continued to make more money. There was a feel-good moment. Oh, they heard our cry. And then it all dissipated. And in response, the protests that were in the streets around George Floyd, if you listen carefully to what happened at the Capitol, they stole the chants from the George Floyd movement. They literally were saying as they marched towards the Capitol, whose streets are streets? They took our chants.
Let me be clear. Ferguson. Just say that right.
And it goes all the way back to Ferguson.
Let me just say that I got to rep my hometown right here. Yeah, St. Louis. They took the chant. So what I'm suggesting is this: people that feel aggrieved are so blinded by their feeling aggrieved that they cannot see the need to unify with others who share in a grievance. And this has been exploited by political parties for their own benefit. And so we have to be wise, to use scripture, wise as a serpent, peaceful as a dove, but more importantly, wise in recognizing this does not serve us as a human family. The civil rights movement was a civil and human rights movement for freedom. It benefited all people, not just Black and brown people. The civil rights movement benefited this nation. White, Black, indigenous. It was to the benefit of all of us. And so we cannot allow folks to convince us that if Black, brown, indigenous folks have some level of success and upward movement, that in any way diminishes poor whites.
And again, I'm starting to feel a little something because I have to go after him, which is, bothering me, but okay, I'm gonna try to do this, right? So, Brother Bishop, something you said earlier about the lies that Donald Trump and the Republican Party told to lots of Americans, particularly, and it was believed, these lies were believed by lots of white Americans. The one thing I will say, though, is that the right are not the only ones who do a lot of lying to people, right? And I think, and this gets back to my, earlier point about the importance of vision, the importance of having that dream about a different kind of America, right? So one of the lies that I think we have grown increasingly confident and comfortable with that Cedric has alluded to is this lie that somehow capitalist corporations will help us see our way out of these problems we have of joblessness, of an economy that is bifurcating between highly paid, highly skilled, and a service sector that is growing, that people are struggling to pay rent and put food on the table. And that segment of the population is growing. We call them essential workers during the pandemic because they kept this place from completely falling apart. And they also had the burden of disproportionately being impacted by COVID, those Black and brown and poor white people and indigenous people who were exposed to this virus in ways that many other folks were not. And so one of the things I think we have to really struggle with is this capitalist system that is creating the kind of inequality that exists in our society, right? And this may be another episode to have that conversation. I think the other thing that's also really important is we've got to get away from the idea that plutocrats like Donald Trump and others will somehow save us and get us out of these problems, when in fact they are in cahoots with the very people who are also engineering these inequities that exist in our country. And so for me, we need to step back and we need to reevaluate who our friends are and who our adversaries are. We need to reevaluate the nature of this economic and political system, right? Another conversation to have is about the filibuster, about the Senate, about the rules of our political system that disadvantage people who want radical change and transformation, right? So there's a lot more we could talk about that we're leaving off the table just on this episode, even though we've gotten through quite a bit. Did we lose you, Bishop Selders?
No, I'm not lost at all. I'm not lost. I'm right here. Can we say a little bit more about what I think is the truth telling that we ought to do about how this country got founded anyway? Can we just lay that, just make it clear that the people, the elite that decided let's go west and discover India at another, let's don't take the Silk Road. Let's go on the flat world and go the other way, and we're gonna come to India. There go we discovered Indians. There were people already here in the Caribbean. But anyway, let's tell the truth that they came here to make some money. All right, the European powers came here to make money. That has always been the project. The project of white supremacy, racism is its fundamental goal is money making. So let's tell that truth, right? The ergo, the enslavement period, servitude, enslavement period, and all of that, and now in this de facto Jim Crow, thank you, Michelle Alexander. We here we are again. It's about money making, right? And to think that money makers are going to be at the end of delivering us from it, that's a hard sell for me. But some folk buy it. In fact, millions of people believe that. So I think we have a task at our hands to actually educating ourselves, telling the truth to ourselves, and then engaging in a project that says that money ain't the be all and end all of it, right? Happiness is not bound in celebrity and the money that you make because you are a celebrity. I'm gonna stop preaching. I'm gonna quit preaching. But can you say a little bit more about that history that we seem to want to skim over real quick? That I think in some way makes it hard for us who are out there in the trenches working on to say, okay, bruh, okay, sis, I know it's hard. I know you gotta make ends meet, and yes, We got to do it and do it rightly, but that we are one part of our entire community. And I bet you if we did it together, we'd do it better. We do it and we get there, we go farther together than if we do it individually.
Yeah. This notion of money being the end all be all. Well, when the Supreme Court of the United States basically decided that corporations are people, that corporations have every right to influence the politics, to contribute huge amounts of money to get politicians to do their bidding, and that was perfectly acceptable, that they are just like any other human being, that corporations need to breathe and need to be allowed to make the amounts of money that they desire to make and have the rules serve that interest. That was so destructive to this notion of this democratic project. Then on the heels of that, preclearance is stripped from the Voting Rights Act, which therefore means we have solved the problem of race. We have addressed that in voting. There's no need to punish these southern states for their past ills. They have rectified that, no need anymore. It sent a chilling message that in order to survive in this country, by hook or by crook, you need to amass as much wealth as you possibly can by any means necessary. Because in order to participate, you need money. If you don't have enough money, you really don't matter. You don't really matter. If you're poor, it's your fault. The system is fair. Everyone has equal access, was the message that was put out, which we know is not true. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, we were told. All of these messages caused us to strive for that American dream, which most folks nowadays cannot afford to buy a home. And the system is not designed for you to be able to afford a home, because the banks are in charge. You're not in charge. Banks tell you whether you qualify. And they determine who will or will not be eligible for a mortgage. And they determine how much you will pay on that mortgage. So who's in charge? Corporations. We get right back to corporations, and they are in charge. And so I think that what's required of us is to get back to recognizing that we can work to transform the systems, but we can also work outside of those systems. Before we sought banking money, we had ways that we bartered with one another. We exchanged goods. We found a way to have our own separate economies that fed us and kept us going while also working within the existing system. So we have to be sharp and quick and nimble in how we manage this need for resources, which sometimes resources aren't dollars. Sometimes resources are skills. And we use our skills and we make enough money and we circulate our dollars in ways that serve our interests, and recognize that we can then plug into that system, the larger system, when we need to, but we are not completely reliant upon the system. That's another tool in our toolbox. Just like voting is one tool, it's not the only tool. We can work outside and inside if we choose to.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time. The one thing I will say is that I think part of the challenge that is ahead of us is to really think very deeply about, and I keep returning to this theme, the kind of country we want America to be. And that vision that we can all be pulled together towards is something that we've got to be able to engage in dialogue across communities to create that vision. And I come at this with the recognition that that vision will, of necessity, entail a dismantling of a lot that is already in place, something that a lot of people are very comfortable with and also have benefited tremendously from. And that has to come down. That has to be torn apart, and we need to create something new, something that is built on a foundation in which there is much greater equality, greater and fairer treatment of individuals, a kind of prosperity that is broadly shared by everyone, not just a small segment of the population who disproportionately benefits. That will take a lot of thinking and a lot of hard work, and we will face a lot of resistance. And we saw what some of that resistance may look like a year ago. And unfortunately, that has not gone away. And that's a part of what we face and will have to struggle with in our country. But I think there are a lot of people in this country who want to see things changed, who want to see racial and economic equity in this society. And we need to work together. We need to struggle together. We need to cry together. We need to love each other. And I think we can move forward. I always tell people I'm not necessarily an optimistic person, but I'm a hopeful person. And I think if we begin to have those conversations and take seriously the need to really make those kinds of changes, I think we can move forward as a society.
Audre Lorde said something to the effect that we can't dismantle this thing using the same tools that they used to build it. I'm paraphrasing her. This is her idea. And so I think you're correct. In many ways, the dream that keeps getting referenced that Dr. King had something to do about judging children not by the color of their skin, but the content of character, right? The dream had something to do with folks sitting down at the same table and hashing it out. Didn't mean that we was gonna necessarily do that in a quiet, just, oh, isn't that sweet? Struggle is struggle, right? I'ma just, in my family, we, it's at a volume, yeah, right. So struggle is struggle, right? It's at the end of the day, what we want is that we all benefit, right? And we all benefit leaving the table, getting what we need, right? And I think the hopefulness that I have, and I'm more hopeful than not, but then some days I'll be like, oh my God, you know what? I'm packing my stuff and see y'all later. I'll be on an island somewhere, it's sipping on some coconut.
Don't forget about your brother when you go now. Don't forget about him.
Right? Because some days I want to say it could go to Hades and I'm out of here, right? But there are many days that I'm like, okay, let's get in here and get to work. And let's do the good old hard work. Some of us, quite frankly, have to just get over ourselves and get on to the business of the good old hard work of organizing, talking to folk, living with folk, being on the ground with folk, hearing what their concerns are, and they're struggling with what it means. Because sometimes, it's hard to hear Pook and Ray Ray and them because they be right. And I want to say, boy, you give me a high five on that one. You sure right. I want to throw it out. I want to, throw it, burn it up too sometimes. And yet I come out on the other side of those conversations, understanding a couple of things. One, our humanity is extremely important and has to be observed. I think in large measure, what's missing here is, and I think you said it, Reverend Harvey, you this fear-based thing, right? It's gotta, Dr. King talked about this. He talked about what we talk about in our work, the deep abiding love, right? And again, that's not mamsy-pamsy, and I ain't talking about just we shall overcome. I'm not speaking it in terms of a kind of surface way. I'm speaking about what happens when you're in the struggle with folk over time, right? When you are in the work overtime, there's a kind of love and regard and respect for each other that only comes when you're in the struggle, in the trenches with one another. Community is built in community. It's not built somewhere else. Community happens in community, and to some degree, and to a large degree, what we don't have is community, right? And we don't have community that exists in the way that it exists in Cedric's hometown. Centerville was a particular kind of community. Kinloch was a particular kind of community, right?
Don't overlook Detroit, where I'm from. Don't overlook Detroit.
Understand. We come from these places that actually had their handprint, those handprints of those big mamas and grandmas and granddaddies and aunties, TTs. In my neighborhood, on my block, Nosy Miss Jackson, Lord have mercy. Nosy Miss Jackson knew everything that happened in the community, and she kept us all on the straight and narrow. If we was out of order, Mama and them heard about it from Nosy Miss Jackson. But that her participation in community meant that the young people in the community we didn't just go whole crazy. We didn't run amok, that there was some accountability. That's what I'm talking about right there. And for me, what's lacking in many ways is a sense of accountability to the larger community. We've gotten away from that in some ways, so that what happened a year ago, and I've been listening to some of the reactions over the last couple of days to hearing folk talk about, what happened last year. And one of the things that struck me, and we got to go, so we'll close here, is that some people are saying how much they, here we are a year later, and we haven't come full circle around the accountability piece, right? We got leaders on a particular side that said didn't nothing really happen hard. It just was a little something other, Others of us were like, what? It was a thing, right? And then you had people who lost lives. You have people who are traumatized. You have, who you have staffers, and thank you, Reverend Harmon, for saying that. Staffers who I can't even imagine. I've been to Capitol Hill once or twice. I've been on the halls. You don't see the legislators, you see the workers. I mean, from the people who sweep and mop and fix the food to the security and all them people, and then the staffers in the offices. Because when I do go see Congressman Larson, I shake his hand and he says, "See my," and I have to go talk to them. Right? It's all of the other people who were there too. Right? And what this meant for their lives, and how do you frame living in that way when we haven't quite figured out yet how to hold all of the folk accountable to their participation. So I appreciate the select committee and what the work that they're doing. Just to name, this happened, y'all. There were texts made. This just didn't happen because somebody went to a rally one day and they got excited. See, there was some planning. There was some work that was at play. This was built on, if y'all want to go back, 2016, and Madam Secretary and Madam Secretary and the cry was lock her up, right? Because somehow or another Russia wasn't really involved. She was into. There was another whole story that was told that then gets reenacted when you say, our election is fraud, right? It is fraught with irregularities. This was a theme that was a recycled thing. So I'm saying all that to say, at the end of it for me, there is this sense of what is resonant with a whole lot of folk. I'm with you, Dr. Sekou, that there are a lot of folk that want things to change, right? I'm with some of those folk. And I think a number of us have to be willing. And here's maybe another piece of this puzzle. Own the courage to be willing not to stay with the status quo, not to stay complacent, but to say, I'm gonna risk maybe losing a friend or two and say what I think need be said, because it's the God's honest truth as I live it, as I experience it, as I believe it. And I think and you all are leaders. When you have done that, when you've run the risk of stepping beyond what was laid out for you, what you were supposed to say, or how you were supposed to act, and you were willing to risk with a sense of courage and some humility, that people come alongside you and join you in the effort. I can tell you that's what's happened with Moore DCT. We decided, let's do something here. Let's take a stand here, and people came alongside us and have joined us in that effort. Any last questions or any last comments? I know we got to go. I held you way too long. Thank you all for hanging here with us. Come on, Dr. Sekou.
I was just going to say thank you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. Hopefully my sister and my mother are in Pennsylvania actually listening to this, so I have to do this. Hi, mommy.
Lord,
thank you so much. Once again,
they can get degrees and everything, but they can turn right into them children. We're number one. Hi, mommy. We do that all the time. Thank you, brother. We respect and regard you. And what you do and how you are to us and for us here. Reverend Harmon, any last word?
Thank you so much. It was great being with both of you and being with the viewing audience and listening audience. I think that it really ends with this, that we are all part of a interwoven network of human love. And if we can get back to that, recognizing that even with the divisions that exist, we have some shared common interests, and we have a shared common humanity. And if we work towards that so that everyone can have a safe place to lay their head at night, some food to put in their belly, some cash to deal with the exigencies of life that show up, that we all arrive at the right place. But as long as one child goes to bed hungry tonight, we are not fully human. We are lessened by that child's hunger. As long as one person dies unnecessarily, we are lessened by that death. And so long as one person feels unloved, we are lessened by their sense of isolation. So we must find a way to come back to a place of unity around our common and shared humanity. And it's possible, but it's going to take a lot of courage, a lot of patience, and a huge amount of risk.
Well, I couldn't have said it no better than that. I really appreciate you. Those of you who joined us or who will see this later, thank you for your commitment to listening to a couple of brothers who have at it for a little while tonight about stuff we think about a lot, and stuff we feel about, and stuff we actually are working through. I'm not always hopeful. Yeah, I'm gonna just be that. I'm gonna tell you. Some days I wake up, I'm mad as Hades, and I want to just, I can feel it like some of the brothers and sisters do out there in the street. Other days I wake up, I'm inspired, and I'm like, yes, we're gonna go get it done. And I think I'm not by myself. I think there all of us are at places and spaces on the journey. What is helpful for me is that I know I'm in community with others. And so when I'm down, somebody else can pick it up. All right. Or when I'm feeling pretty good right now and I ain't gonna be defeated, I can leap over walls, run through troops, and be super, and my superpowers are working. I'm gonna get it done, right? But there are other days that I'm not so, and that there are others of us who can do that kind of work, who can pick up the mantle, who can pick it up. And let me say this as well as we close. There is a community, a generation of young people coming in behind us who are wanting to do, and so part of the responsibility, I believe, is to help them, give them space. Don't suck up all the space, and be the elders that we now are. At least some of us are. Some of y'all looking, a couple of y'all looking younger than you. Anyway, I appreciate you. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom, sharing your time and your energy to this effort. I would love to hear you in the comments. Continue to comment. You wanted more information about what we're doing, how we're doing, what we're doing. Go to More Monday CT and on all of our platforms and all of our websites. Our website and the platforms will be there. We're promised to we've made the commitment to stay in the struggle. We're gonna be there. All right. How about you? Thank you all. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for joining us. Peace.